Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Well, Ethan, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. And thanks to the Jewish Book Council, which is really providing a great service to authors these days. With the pandemic still with us, hopefully kind of tapering off, it's very difficult to do live events for authors these days. And it's very difficult for us as authors to connect with readers, except through events like this. So I'm nothing but appreciative to JBC and to all of you for joining us tonight. We're here to talk about my new book, which is right here behind me. Thank you very much, Ethan. 12 Tribes, Promise and Peril in the New Israel. It's a very different approach to writing about Israel than other books about the country. If you've read Tom Friedman or Amos Oz or any of the other books that have been out in the last few years, this is very much a grassroots portrait of Israel, one in which I go and do dozens of interviews with people who are not necessarily pundits or not at all pundits or generals or elected officials or leaders of a kind of public nature. They're people who operate at the grassroots. They're people with real interesting perspectives on Israel and quite a bit to say about the situation in Israel today, but they're not individuals who are necessarily used to speaking in the media. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to them. I should say from the beginning that I'm an American Jew with a lot of relatives in Israel. I speak Hebrew fluently. And I've gone to Israel many times. My mother lives in Israel. My brother lives in Israel. Most of my family is there. And I have gone over my lifetime many times to Israel, but never before as a journalist, as a writer. And so this was an opportunity for me to really get there and talk to people that I'd always wanted to talk to in some cases, track down some people who were legends of my childhood in some cases, and really also investigate the situation in communities that I had not had a chance to visit before. So if you've already read 12 Tribes, you know what's in there. But if you haven't, then you'll see that you'll find the story of the one true king of falafel, who is an individual who rose from obscurity to become the king of falafel and is now transferring his talents over into Israel's thriving real estate industry. You'll learn certainly about the young people who are thriving in the tech industry, but you'll also see the dark side of the tech world in Israel, the way that the tech world in Israel is using some techniques that some people will find really unsavory and really difficult to think of as emanating from Israel. You'll talk to, you get to visit with me as your guide. You'll get to visit a memorial for a long dead rabbi from Romania, who has whose memorial in the otherwise secular neighborhood of Givatayim, where most of my family lives, has become this massive gathering for religious Jews all over the country. It really brings tens of thousands of Haredim to this, as I said, otherwise secular neighborhood every year for an event that's both raucous and interesting and very, very deeply Jewish. And really an event that even relatives of mine in Givatayim have trepidation about going into. And yet I take you there in the book. You'll also go with me into the West Bank, into the territories that are governed by the Palestinian Authority, but still have a significant presence of the Israeli military there. You'll get to see that from the perspective of someone experiencing it at the ground level. You'll get to talk to Palestinians who are there. In those cases, I used my Americanness to get to talk to people, to try to get them to open up and to talk about their lives there. I talked to soldiers as well as Palestinian protesters. I talked with, we go to Ramallah and speak with, which is the capital of the Palestinian Authority, and is a city that in many ways reminds me of Tel Aviv in the 1970s, has a spirit of entrepreneurship and energy and enthusiasm that was very similar to how I remember Israel when I was a child. But at the same time, I talked with people who were former Hamas activists who had become workers for nonviolence. I talked with a Palestinian American businessman from Cleveland who has a vision for creating the business community, is working hard to establish that business community in what he hopes will be the soon to be independent state of Palestine. All of this is to say that I named this book 12 Tribes, not because I'm a particularly observant person, but if you do know the stories of the 12 tribes in the Tanakh, then you know that the tribes did not get along particularly well. They fought with each other. They conspired against each other, sometimes even working with foreign powers against each other. And I thought that this would be a good metaphor for how Israel was today, how Israel is today, that the different communities in Israel have very strong individual identities and don't always get along, and certainly have different agendas and different interests and different ways of seeing the country and the world altogether. But they are nevertheless part of one family, one kind of polity, one nation that is trying to find its way in a very complicated region, in a very complicated world, in a moment that all nations are really facing an unprecedented assault on their borders, in the way that information and people and disease and money and products are moving across borders like we've never seen before. So all of that was a way to say that I think the 12 tribes I'm not mapping an ancient tribe onto a modern tribe in the sense of saying that the tribe of Benjamin equals a certain group of Israel today. No, it's merely just a metaphor to say that these are the relationships within Israel's diverse groups is a tribal relationship, and is one in which people deeply feel their loyalty to their own particular group, and that may result in a challenge to another particular group, or multiple particular groups, as it may be. My first book was very different. It's a history of the Chicago Defender newspaper, which is the African-American newspaper in Chicago. But it's also a book with a deeply personal, that has a deeply personal reason for me writing it. The Defender was somewhere, as Ethan very nicely mentioned, was somewhere that I worked for 5.5 years, and afterwards, inspired by the Defender, I worked in Chicago's public housing communities for another 19 years. So it's really half of my professional life has been in Chicago's African-American communities, and I know very well the power of the institution of the Defender. But I also wrote the book about the Defender because I felt that this was a voice that had not been heard. This was a historical voice that had not been heard, a history that had actually been in some ways covered up. And I wrote this book about 12 tribes. I wrote 12 tribes for a similar reason, in that I feel that there are a lot of voices in Israel today that are simply not being heard. And I don't just mean the voices of you might have heard from some folks out there that some people might pose the situation in Israel as simply one of Israelis versus Palestinians. But I have to say that it's a situation in which there are many, many different groups, again, tribes, if you will, that have many different relationships, both within the Jewish world and within the Palestinian world. There are many tribes. And for example, within the Palestinian communities, there are Palestinian citizens of Israel. They represent 20%, 1 out of 5 Israeli citizens with an Israeli passport who have the full rights of citizenship is a Palestinian. They are, of course, very diverse even within that category. There are Palestinian citizens who are Christians. There are Palestinian citizens who are Druze. There are Palestinian citizens who are Muslims, of course. But even within the Muslim groups, there are many different groups, including those Bedouin who live in the desert, who have a very specific set of concerns and relationships that are very different from even Bedouin of the north. Who are a different group historically. So all of this gets to be aired out in 12 tribes, and I think you'll find it fascinating, partially as people who I think are interested and care about Israel, like most of us do, but also I think just as American Jews who come from an American Jewish community that is very different. And the American Jewish community is increasingly diverse, certainly, but is overwhelmingly homogeneous. It's overwhelmingly made up of people descended from those Ashkenazi immigrants from Eastern Europe, mainly in the beginning of the 20th century. That's still upwards of a very, very strong majority of Jews in the United States. The community in Israel, of course, is very, very different. In Israel, you have people who are recent immigrants from all over the world. You have 1 million people who are from Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union. You have over 100,000 people who are from Ethiopia, and Ethiopian Jews whose connection to Israel is sometimes, I think, drawn very weakly or tenuously, but is really one that goes back thousands of years and is really part of this intimate connection between Ethiopia and the Holy Land, between Ethiopian Jews as well as Ethiopian Christians and Muslims back to Jerusalem, that goes back to the beginnings of those faith communities. So all of that is a way to say that the Israeli, it's just a statistic to kind of illustrate what I'm saying about the diversity of the Israeli Jewish world, that over 60% of the Israeli Jews are those that are descended from Mizrahi communities, meaning that they're generally folks who follow the Sephardic rites, but have ancestry from North Africa, Central Asia, or the Middle East. That's a very different composition than what we have in the United States, as I mentioned earlier. So all of that is to say that Israel's diversity is exactly what I'm exploring in 12 tribes, and exactly what I hope you'll be fascinated by, and what you'll be intrigued by, and also that you'll come away with an understanding of how different how the different poles of the Jewish world really now have to find a way to get along. Because Israel and the United States today are really almost the entire world Jewish community. We each represent a slightly over 40% of the world's Jewish population, which is to say that together we are over 80% of the world's Jewish population. That means that the two poles of the Jewish world are now Israel and the United States in a way that has never happened in Jewish history before, except perhaps if we go way, way back to the time of before the Roman expulsion, when you had the population bifurcated between Israel and Mesopotamia. So you have to go back an awfully long way before we can think of the Jewish world as being divided into these two halves in this way. We also have to think about how the Jewish community in the United States and the Jewish community in Israel are changing, because the relationship between us has changed dramatically in the last couple of decades. We're used to thinking, I think, as American Jews, of Israel as, if I can just say this bluntly, something of a charity, in the sense that American Jews are the ones that are giving aid to Israel, and we're helping Israel survive economically as well as militarily. Today, you may or may not know, Israel no longer gives any financial aid. I'm sorry, the United States no longer gives any financial aid to Israel at all. And in terms of the military aid that goes to the United States, you have to consider that that aid is now fully enmeshed with companies that are based in the United States. Even the Israeli arms manufacturers like Elbit Systems, which is Israel's second largest arms manufacturers, are actually based in the United States. Elbit Systems just moved their headquarters to Texas because they do as much business with other parts of the world as they do with Israel. The military industrial complex that President Eisenhower talked about in his closing address is one that exists in both Israel and the United States in a fully integrated way that, again, has never really happened before. The United States also is as you'll read about in the book, is fully enmeshed with Israel's criminal justice system in a way that has never happened before. All of that is something that we really don't talk about much as American Jews. We're focused mainly these days on I think what has become an increasingly vituperative argument about the struggle with the Palestinians, but all of these things are going on and are very much dramatic changes that have not taken place, that have not really been discussed or aired out. The last thing I want to say before I'm happy to kind of take questions and engage in anything that you guys want to talk about. And by the way, I should say that I'm certainly I've been following what's happening, as Ethan said. Oh, and I want to say one note. I did give you a little bit of my personal background, but I didn't explain. Ethan very kindly pronounced my name Eitan, which is the way that my parents intended for my name to be pronounced. My parents, who are of Hungarian extraction and spent much time in Israel, read E-T-H-A-N as Eitan and don't particularly hear the delightful TH sound that makes Ethan a very melodious name. So while my name is spelled Ethan, Ethan very kindly pronounced it correctly as Eitan. So thank you for that, Ethan.
It takes an Eitan to know an Eitan.
Thank you very much. Well said. The last thought I want to leave you with is that if you've been following Israel in the last 24 hours, you certainly know about the horrible terrorist attacks that have been happening in Tel Aviv. These are simply kind of horrible nihilistic attacks in the middle of population centers. Really, just there is no other word to call them except for terror. That is, I believe, what they're designed to do, is to frighten people and horrify them. And so that's certainly something we can discuss. But I also would like to call your attention to the fact that earlier this week, there was a shakeup in Israel's new government, in that one of the members of its coalition defected to the other side, and leaving the current government now with a 60 votes grouping. It's no longer a majority and it's not a minority. So they are actually in a kind of weird stasis in which it may or may not be possible to pass any legislation or move anything forward. If any other folks defect from the current coalition in the government, that would create an opportunity for former Prime Minister Netanyahu to return, or more likely for new elections. The reason I mentioned that is because Israel's political situation was very clear to us, I think, for many years when Prime Minister Netanyahu was at the helm. We had an American-sounding and English-speaking prime minister communicating very clearly to all of us in terms of as American Jews, explaining Israel to us and explaining Israel's positions and its policies to us, even if we didn't agree. Now things have changed. Now we have to look at an Israeli government that is much more inwardly focused, that is much more a composite of all of Israel's different groups that doesn't engage with the American audience in the same kind of way, isn't even interested in engaging, I would argue, with American Jews in exactly the same kind of way. So I just want to leave you with that thought that whether or not Prime Minister Netanyahu comes back for another bout, I still believe that we are entering the post-Netanyahu era, and it will look very different. It will feel very different. And for those that care about Israel, it will really require understanding all of those much more than 12 tribes that are within Israel to really get a grip on what's happening and what's possible and what could happen in Israel. All right, so maybe I'll shut up there and
I got some questions for you.
Yeah,
you covered a bunch of it, but I have some questions for you.
Yeah.
So one of the things you touched on, and I had a bunch of, I didn't know where our conversation would go. I should tell everybody, Eitan and I had a chance to talk. It was probably about a month ago. And I think we were scheduled to speak for about a half an hour, and about 90 minutes later, I had to run to another meeting. Otherwise, I think we would have still been talking.
Yes.
I guess it has something to do with the name. We just talk for a while. I wanted to read a really brief portion from your introduction. There were a number of passages, but so to just kind of set the scene, and I go back to this point of Eitan describes it as being grassroots, but I feel it's deeply human the way that you're telling these stories. So you happen to be en route to Israel by way of Hong Kong. And after having had this experience, which anybody who's ever flown to Israel understands the kind of necessary and intentional kind of fear that's kind of put into you. You get on the plane and you happen to have a cousin who's a pilot for El Al, and you get invited up to the cockpit to speak with these pilots. And as you are kind of finishing your several hour conversation, you kind of relay this. And so I just want to read this brief passage before we get into it, which is to say, you say, in my half dreams, the journey itself became the destination. And I imagine the whole nation of Israel as one great vessel soaring through the darkness, a vessel full of long-lost sisters and brothers dressed in the costumes they had adopted during their long sojourns, pouring tea from intricately decorated samovars, or serving thick black coffee from little pots with the grounds at the bottom, passing around a bottle of schnapps as they negotiated, debated, and regaled each other with improbable stories, often in different languages from one another, but with the certainty and the joy that their gatherings together was itself evidence of their designated role in this cosmic design. They had each miraculously escaped brutal oppressors and mobs of murderers, hadn't they? Surely their course was now charted by divine hands. And yet up in the cockpit, the pilot guiding the vessel in my dream was growing increasingly anxious as he gazed out onto the horizon. Not because of any external threats, but because he knew that in the not so distant future, one of the passengers would have to replace him. And he had real doubts that any of his potential successors would have the crucial ability to discern up from down, a basic necessity in keeping the plane from crashing into the ground. One of the things that is remarkable throughout the book is that every single person you encounter, and I also want to get to the fact that this book is clearly deeply personal for you, especially through the lens we see it through yours, your brothers and your mothers, and the families. But every character we encounter along the way is in itself microcosmic of the story of how Israel was created. You are meeting a new generation of people living in the diaspora trying to find a way to get home and live at home and find a new place. And Israel as a country next year will celebrate its 75th birthday. It is still very young. And I'm curious what your gleanings were of how the history has repeated itself in such a small period of time.
Oh, wow, what a great question. Well, I think I should probably give a little sketch of my family history just to kind of fill everybody in who hasn't read the book, hasn't had a chance to read the book. So my parents were both are from Budapest. They're both they both survived the Shoah as teenagers. My mother and her mother were taken to Auschwitz and then a work camp overall for more than a year. My father fled various efforts to be arrested in Budapest after the war, they both joined Habonim, the youth Zionist organization. And they both, my father snuck my mother out of Hungary and many others out of Hungary, and then joined my mother, and they went to Hungary together and joined the kibbutz on the Sea of Galilee. So I mention that to say that the book contains interviews with Hungarian Holocaust survivors, other friends of my mother who get together for a Saturday brunch every week, and did it even often during COVID as much as they could. They took some time off, but as soon as they were able to get back, they started their breakfast again. Also the kibbutz, where my parents spent time, features in the book. It's kibbutz Magan on the Sea of Galilee, if anybody's been there. So, and my older brother Gabi was born there. Gabi never lived in, he lived in the United States only when he was in high school, and he's 17 years older than I am. So I only lived with him for a year before he moved back to Israel. So he's really Israeli. He's a lawyer. He lives in Givatayim, and so he tells the story of Israel, and my mother tells the story of Israel quite differently. They definitely have a deep stake in the country in the way that only a Shoah survivor, and my brother Gabi is a veteran of the 73 war, and has children in Israel and now grandchildren in Israel. So he has his own stakes in the country in that way. And as someone born there, he has a different perspective. Neither are uncritical of many things that they see there, but they certainly have a deep affection for the country and don't look at or encourage looking at Israel kind of from a theoretical point of view, which is to say that I think a lot of the conversation in the United States is around, should Israel be allowed to exist? You know, is it okay? Is it ethical? Is it moral for Israel to kind of be like, to be there? And I'm sorry, but for my mother, as for my brother, and for everybody in between in their generations and beyond, for the most part, that's just not a conversation anymore. I wrote this book in many ways because the conversations that we have in the United States, even as people who care deeply about Israel, and I'm including people who are real critics of Israel, we're talking about things that are not relevant to Israelis anymore. Very often when I go and visit Israel, I'll say, oh, what happened with this? And they're like, oh, that thing, that happened, that was a year ago. That was, of course, that would be the same thing if someone was to come to the United States. But the passage that you read is one in which I'm expressing the anxiety of someone who very much recognizes that Israelis are feeling the crisis in their own country, but that we, as people outside of that plane, really have no idea what it's about. So that's kind of the where I was going with that. I feel like we're certainly. I was part of a conversation a few weeks ago where an American Jew, described himself as a non-voting citizen of Israel. That's a bit strong for me. It's like, I'm not a citizen of Israel, voting or non-voting. It's a different relationship that I have. I care about Israel. Israel is a deep part of my consciousness but it's not. I am not a citizen. That's a different thing.
And there's a piece of that plays into, I think, Jewish identity strongly, and we can have a long discussion about how and why that has been cultivated to be that way. But the sense of ownership and entitlement over it that I think the book really brilliantly says, like, there needs to be some separation. And I think there's some separation anxiety on the part of, there were pieces that I was reading in the book where I was like, as an American Jew, I think I have always thought that I'm supposed to have a say in this thing, and I realized that I don't. And part of what really struck me about reading the book and it's actually one of the things that I wanted to get into, is that it's so much more nuanced, but in a lived reality way than we can understand, because we're not there. And we struggle to make that connection. It's, you met with and talked with people, both Israelis and Palestinians, who had feelings about politics. And the first to admit, most of your trips to Israel were either, from 2014 to 2017 and 18, and also, in the epilogue, you talk about what was happening to these people during COVID. But during a time in American politics where how we thought about Israel was really, having been on a college campus during this time, these bigger picture theoretical questions were like the crux of the argument here. And everybody there is just doing their thing, and they have opinions about how we should relate, but they're also not letting it stop them from continuing to live and grow as Israelis in their identity in their country. Whereas here, it actually can be a roadblock for growth. It's actually something that stops us dead in our tracks.
I mean, that's exactly right. I mentioned the kibbutz Ma'agan, where my brother was born, right? The person that I interviewed there he was born in Morocco, Amnon ben Shushan. And so he's a Moroccan who came to Israel in the Zionist movement as a young man, helped to found the kibbutz, was a very strong advocate for the kibbutz movement throughout his career, and for Israel and for the Zionist movement. Amnon was sent to North Africa during the Algerian Revolution. He's in his 90s now. And he was sent there during the Algerian Revolution and recounted, I thought this was really lovely, how the French would come to him and say, "Oh, you Israelis, you were so good at defeating the Arabs. Can you tell us how you did that?" And meanwhile, the rebels would come to him, the Arab rebels would come to him and they would say, "Oh, you Israelis were so good at defeating the British and getting rid of them from Palestine. How did you do that?" And it was, Israel was being seen at that moment through different lenses, and Amnon was, a different lens himself, right? He was someone who was not a European going to Israel. He was an African, a North African, a Moroccan. His perspective is carrying those identities with him: a French identity, a Moroccan identity. His father has a strong British identity. His mother had a very strong Jewish Moroccan identity that might even go back to Berber, to the Berber Jews. So he carries with him a whole set of identities, which he then imparted to his children. Right? It's going to be very difficult for someone to make an argument to Amnon on any level that he doesn't belong there, hasn't earned his place there, hasn't. If you see what I'm getting at, it's that it'd be very difficult to describe him as a European. He's not. It's very difficult to describe him as pretty much anything that you want to kind of saddle him with, and in that respect, almost everyone in Israel has those kind of identities that are so deeply rooted that the kind of questions that we're lobbing at them here, that I often hear, and don't get me wrong, I feel like the people here very often when they're talking about Israel, they're talking from a place of care and concern. They want Israel to realize, even the ones that are wrong, I'll say, in their vision, they still are talking about a vision for Israel, a place that they care about, that they want, to realize. So a vision of justice and peace that they want to realize. So I understand that, and I don't want to disrespect that. I'm just saying that within Israel itself, it's important to consider how those arguments might be taken.
So I want to switch directions for a second. I told you earlier that I had a question. So one of the people that you meet, although if I remember correctly, it was while you were still in the States, is Gil Hovav, who is an
Yes.
Israeli chef and food personality, and being a food person myself. I have to tell you, one of the things that I loved about the book, and I hope this is just something that continues, is every meal you had was described. It's not a book you should read on an empty stomach. You will become very hungry. But what I'm curious is, and especially in that conversation you had with him, it talked about the fact how food plays and tells that story of social change. We live in a culture right now where we are utterly fascinated, in some ways maybe too fascinated, with the idea of who owns a cuisine, who owns a culture, the idea of cultural appropriation of food. And in Israel, and I can say this from my stint, both spending time in Israel and having worked on an Israeli food truck, I don't know who owns hummus, but I want to eat as much of it as possible and learn the different cultural variations. And so I'm curious, A, was this intentional, or are we going to get a travel writing book about the food? And if so, can I come along? But more so, how is that lens one that we can also understand kind of this change that's going on in Israeli culture?
Well, I'm going to Israel in a couple of days, and I do have some family members who have some good TV connections. So my pitch to them is to do a food tour of Israel, and I will recommend you to come along. So, look, I should say from the beginning that I never imagined myself as a food writer. I do like food, of course. You can't see me, but I'm a well-fed individual, but when it came to this book, well, if you've ever read Tom Friedman, then you know that Tom Friedman thinks that cab drivers are an amazing window into various societies. So I had that in mind when I was talking to Israeli cab drivers. And one of the ones that I spoke with, named Ofer, is an individual who has a Tunisian mother and a Polish father. And from their cuisines, Ofer fused his own cuisine, which he then passed on to his daughters, and who now kind of combine those foods in a very natural and seamless way. And when I described this to Gil Hovav, who is Israel's most prominent travel writer and celebrity chef.
He is the Anthony Bourdain in some way of Israel. I think it's the best way to put it.
And also a prominent, and also one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, spokespersons for GLBTQ rights.
Yes.
A very outspoken individual on both of those, and also someone who's got a kind of noble lineage in Israel. He's descended from the man that restored the Hebrew language kind of to the system, the systemic.
Which for our Kansas City community, sorry to interrupt, you should also know we have a connection here. Chazan Tal Ben Yehuda, who is the Chazan here at one of our conservative synagogues, also part of that same family lineage.
So that's a great, their family is a great example also of these fusing traditions, because it contains, these Europeans who came with from the pinnacle of European education to found the Jewish state, who married into Yemenite families that had been based in Jerusalem for many generations already. Yemenite families who came to Israel at the first opportunity once the Ottomans reconquered Yemen and opened up that channel. So it's got these Gil's family has this wonderful fusion in his own background, and he certainly likes to generalize the what went on with his family to all of Israel, and to say that the Israeli cuisine certainly contains some element of a fusion of Jewish and Arab cuisine, but is mainly what happened in Ofer's family's mother's kitchen, the fusion of Jewish cuisine from one part of the world and Jewish cuisine from another part of the world. Those two come together, and of course with the natural ingredients, flavors, spices, etc. of the Middle East, you really get something unique. And those of you who visited Israel know what I mean. That it's a place where the food is amazing and great. And I'll if you like my food writing, I'll be thrilled. But I have to be honest that I probably benefited from all that I had to do was describe the food. Like, it wasn't that hard. It was all delicious.
There's a reason that Instagram, especially when people travel, is filled that way. So I guess I have to say, the next time you write the book, is that you got to have an accompanying Instagram account that goes along with it to document. I guess that's my big suggestion coming out of this one. So I want to acknowledge, if folks have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. I certainly have more questions that we're going to have time to talk about tonight. But one that I think another kind of recurring character, and you alluded to the Stephanischer Rebbe earlier, but it was clearly for you, at least it seemed in the sense that this is a personal book, that there's a little bit of a spiritual journey that you're going on through this book, and that you keep coming back. So I'm hoping you can kind of give us the brief. Who was the Stephanischer Rebbe? Yeah. And why do you find, and I have to say, didn't know a lot about him, now know more about him, also spent some time on the Wikipedia page and some other places to do some other research. How and why are you fascinated by him? And what are we to make of the status of this centuries-old dead rabbi whose body was moved to Israel and is celebrated this way every year?
So those who haven't read the book are going to really wonder what is going on with the Stephanischer Rebbe, and he's the second Stephanischer Rebbe.
Forgive me, the second.
No apology necessary. So the second Stephanischer Rebbe, who is from the Ruzhiner Hasidic dynasty. If anyone is a scholar of Hasidic dynasties, and the Ruzhiners are still around and still a pretty important group. The second Stephanischer Rebbe died in 1935 in Romania, and in 1968. The Ceausescu regime was in the midst of a kind of scheme where they were kind of on the edge of the Soviet world, and Israel was kind of on the edge of the Western world. So it seemed like they had a good opportunity to exchange information, technology, scholars, that kind of thing. And they used the Romanians, the Ceausescu regime used this opportunity to start negotiating for money, because they really wanted money. And so they convinced the Israeli government to purchase the freedom of a lot of the Jewish community in Romania. There were 300,000 Jews in Romania at that time, a pretty large community after World War II. And many of them wanted to leave, but they weren't being allowed to go. So Israel raised money, and the United States, the Jewish community in the United States also gave a lot of money. And they started to donate money, and Jews from Romania, I interviewed one woman in the book whose family had no idea where they were going. They just kind of one day were told to come to the visa office and got like passports, and then showed up and the next day at the airport and were realized they were headed to the United States. Well, the Romanian government realized that if they this was pretty lucrative, and if they could do this with live Jews, maybe they could do it with Jews who'd already passed away. So they went to the Hasidic community specifically and said the grave of this guy, the Stephanischer Rebbe, people are still visiting it. Like, we're a communist country. This isn't good. We're going to have to raise the tomb. We're going to destroy the tomb. Unless, I don't know, maybe you guys want to move it. So the Hasidic communities all over the world began a campaign, put together the money, and they brought the Stephanischer Rebbe's body they had to decide where to bring it, of course, in Israel. They brought it to the Nachalat Yitzchak cemetery in Givatayim. Givatayim is where my family lives. It's where I always went as a kid going to Israel. it's a suburb of Tel Aviv. It's very secular. There are cafes there and non-kosher restaurants, and things open up. Things close on Shabbat like everywhere else in Israel, but they open up as soon as it's as it's possible. And there's no chametz there, but you certainly won't find, you won't have trouble finding people walking around with a sandwich or something like that. Even on Pesach, no one will be embarrassed to do that in this neighborhood. The Nachalat Yitzchak Cemetery, though, is a cemetery in Israel. Like, everybody is there. There are even some Haredi rabbis who are buried there, like some very important venerated rabbis. So when the Stefanischer's body was moved, the Stefanischer Rebbe's body was moved to this cemetery, it was not that unusual. But what became unusual was the yearly gathering on the according to the Jewish calendar, of course, his Hilulah, his memorial, every year became a bigger and bigger celebration, a party really, for Haredi people from all over all over Israel, really all over the world. I have to tell you that among my Haredi friends who are, how do I say this, like better educated and kind of better off, when I tell them about this, they're kind of chagrined. They're like, oh, you don't want to go to that kind of event. It's kind of like a street festival or something. Like, they don't think that it presents the Haredi world in the best light. They think that it's a kind of, low class event. But for me, yeah.
I was saying, in a way, it's kind of like people visiting Central Park to, the circle where John Lennon. I mean, it's got an allure to it that is out of place in any aspect of modern, like, Jewish life, and like how we observe a Yortzeit usually.
Sure, and there are many kinds of Haredi festivals that you can go to. This one is just one that they think of as kind of really grassroots, which is of course exactly why I wanted to go, because the people that I spoke with there were people who were there. They didn't particularly care that he was the politics that I mentioned about the Ceausescu regime. None of that was interesting to them. To them, what was more interesting was the legend that when the Stefanischer's body was removed from its tomb in Romania, that the corpse was intact, as if he had just been buried earlier that day. That to them was a far more powerful story than anything that I was talking about with the Ceausescu regime, right? So for them, this was something that had a power that was beyond global politics. Whereas for me, it was very much this kind of very interesting moment in global politics. When I would go back to visit, there was the time. It's a very busy place during the memorial. There's thousands of people there, but I went back many times, and I would go, kind of late at night on my way back home, or going to visit my mom or something like that. And I would find people there. Like, one time I found a guy there who was. It looked like if I was guessing, but he was in the process of becoming a Baal Tshuva. Like he was in the process of becoming Haredi, because he had peot, he had like the curls, and he had a thick beard, and was wearing a kippah, of course, but he was also wearing shorts and hiking shoes, and he was lying on top of the Stefanischer's tomb, hugging it, and I thought maybe he was disturbed or something. So I didn't want to, kind of jump up on him. So I dropped a couple of coins in the tzedakah box that was there, and he kind of stirred and looked around, very embarrassed, and said, "Oh, I just wanted to hug the tzaddik, the righteous man." And I told him, of course, I totally understood, and he, still embarrassed, like dashed off into the night. So those interactions that I had there, that was what the treasure was for me. That was what I guess, I've thought a lot about why I kept coming back. And it was because of these encounters with Haredi people. I should also say that from my family's point of view, the Haredim they even will use the word on occasion, they're enemies. The Haredi people are competitors when it comes to space. The Haredi people would love to expand from neighboring Bnei Brak into Givatayim. The Givatayim folks would love to build malls and swimming pools and other kinds of things that they enjoy, and Bnei Brak stands in the way of that kind of stuff. So there's a direct competition within between Haredim and secular people within Israel, and there are very few chances for Haredi people to engage with secular people in what I think is a respectful, productive way. So that's really what I treasured there, is it would be these kind of goofy encounters, but ones in which there was the chance, the possibility for us to make a real connection.
So I want to be respectful of everybody's time,
yeah.
But I want to ask one last question before we end this evening, which is, when you kind of zoom out and you look at the totality of this book, and I think, to be fair, this is as we come up to Passover, B'chol Dor Vador, and every generation, we're probably going to need a look again at how the makeup of the Israeli people are changing, because I think the 12 tribes now are going to be different 15, 20 years from now. They might be different next week, given how politics work in Israel.
Yeah.
What's your grand takeaway? What's that kind of big picture takeaway of kind of maybe what we've been missing and how we think about how Israel is evolving?
Wow, that's a great question. Let me answer a little differently than I have to other groups. You guys are a congregation in the Midwest. You have an opportunity to do something about you, to express your care for Israel in a way that I think is powerful and exciting, and I want to see kind of how you do that in the next couple of years. What does the new government offer to you as a congregation in the United States, in the Midwest, in terms of engaging with Israel? We've had it easy as Americans for a while. We've had this guy, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as I said, who was very comfortable at dealing with Americans. He knew what he wanted from us, and he knew how to get it from us, right? He could say 5 sentences in the Congress, and suddenly we had, he got exactly the kind of responses that he wanted from the American community, friend and foe, right?
Absolutely.
This is a different world. This is a different way of engaging. Again, even if Prime Minister Netanyahu comes back for a while, he's not going to be there forever. And it's up to us, I think, as American Jews, to really find a new way to engage with Israel and think about how we're going to meet them where we can meet them to make a difference.
Amazing. Well, Eitan, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and for sharing your story and this amazing book with us. I hope everybody gets a copy and checks it out. I also know I understand it's being translated. We're getting a paperback, not translated.
Oh, there'll be a paperback.
We're getting a paperback, right? Sorry, confused it with another book that we did.
No.
We're going to see a paperback sometime soon, but you can pick it up. I got my copy of Barnes & Noble and Leawood, so it is something that is on the shelves and accessible to you. So I hope everybody finds it. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the evening, and a happy and healthy Passover to everybody. And Eitan, a Nisiat Tova, a wonderful trip to Israel for you.
Thank you.
When you're leaving in a few days. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Yeah, and Chag Sameach, everybody, and thank you very much.
Thanks.